I never thought I would be standing in the corner of a room I helped build, holding a tray of champagne flutes, while my own daughter pretended she didn't know my last name. But there I was. Let me back up, because if I just told you that part, you'd ask the same thing everyone always asks. Why did you let it get that far? And that's a fair question. It's the question I asked myself every single morning for 14 months. Every time I looked in the mirror and didn't quite recognize the woman looking back at me. My name is Claire. I'm 43 years old. I have a scar above my left eyebrow from a hiking accident in Colorado when I was 26, a coffee habit that my doctor has been lecturing me about for a decade, and until recently, I was the silent co-founder of a mid-sized commercial real estate development firm that I had poured the best years of my adult life into building. I say silent because that was the arrangement my business partner Marcus and I had agreed on when I stepped back 8 years ago. He ran the day-to-day. I stayed in the background. My name wasn't on the website. My face wasn't at the industry events, but my signature was on the original articles of incorporation, and 40% of the company's equity was sitting very quietly in a trust with my name on it. The reason I stepped back was my daughter. She was 22 when her father, my ex-husband, passed away from a sudden cardiac event. She was in her last semester of college, and she fell apart. Completely, visibly, heartbreakingly apart. And I made a decision that I thought was the right one. I put my work on pause. I moved closer to her. I became available in a way I hadn't been when she was growing up, when I was building the company and traveling and doing all the things that ambitious women do, and then spend the rest of their lives quietly apologizing for. So yes, there was guilt involved. I want you to understand that from the beginning, because the story doesn't make sense without it. My daughter's name is Jade. She is smart and beautiful, and has her father's eyes and her grandmother's stubbornness and, as it turned out, a talent for interior design that she had been hiding behind an art history degree. When she was 24, she launched a small residential staging company. I helped her with the startup costs. I didn't advertise that I helped. I just wired the money and watched her work. She met my son-in-law at an industry networking event 2 years later. He worked in commercial leasing and had a handsome face and the kind of confidence that, in my experience, tends to be either genuinely earned or entirely manufactured. With him, it took me longer than it should have to figure out which one it was. They got married quickly. Jade was 27. He was 32. I flew in from Phoenix where I'd been staying that year. I gave a toast at the rehearsal dinner that made half the room cry. And I thought, watching them dance, that maybe everything was going to be fine. It wasn't. The first sign came 3 months into their marriage, when Jade started referring to my financial help as a loan from a family friend. Not once, not by accident, but repeatedly, in conversations with her new in-laws, with her business associates, with people at dinner parties I was sometimes also attending. I let it go. I told myself she was establishing independence. I told myself it didn't matter what other people thought. The second sign came when my son-in-law started managing her business finances. Not because she asked him to, because he inserted himself gradually, the way certain people do, until one day, Jade's company had a new business email signature that included his name as Operations Director without anyone ever having a conversation about it. I brought it up once, gently. Jade told me I was being controlling and that she appreciated my concern, but she was an adult. I backed off. That was my mistake, not the backing off, exactly, but the pattern it established. Every time I backed off, the ceiling dropped a little lower. By the time 14 months had passed, I was spending 3 or 4 days a week at their house helping Jade manage her increasingly large roster of staging clients. I was driving her samples to showrooms. I was receiving furniture deliveries. I was answering her business phone when she was in meetings. And somewhere along the way, my son-in-law had started introducing me to people as Jade's mom who helps out around the business, not as Claire, not as a businesswoman, not by any name or title that acknowledged I had ever done anything of value before the moment I became useful to their household. I want to be honest. I let it happen. I was so desperate to be present, to make up for years of being the mother who missed recitals and forgot school forms because I was closing a deal in Atlanta or reviewing contracts in Seattle, that I confused availability with invisibility. I thought if I was always there, always helpful, always quiet about my own history, that would mean I loved her enough. That would balance the ledger. What it actually did was teach everyone around me that I had no ledger worth balancing. The moment things changed, the moment I finally saw everything clearly, happened on a Tuesday morning in November, and it started with a phone call from Marcus. I was in Jade's kitchen, unpacking fabric swatches for a client presentation she had that afternoon, when my phone buzzed on the counter. I almost didn't answer it. I glanced at the screen, saw Marcus's name, and felt the familiar pull of two different lives. I stepped into the backyard. "Claire," he said. And the way he said my name, not Jade's mom, not anyone's anything, just my actual name, hit me somewhere I had stopped expecting to be hit. "I need you to consider coming back." Marcus explained that the firm had landed a significant contract, the kind that required presenting to a group of out-of-state investors the following month. "He wanted me involved," he said. "And I remember this exactly. You built the relationships that made this deal possible. You should be in the room." I told him I'd think about it. I went back inside. I finished unpacking the swatches. Jade came downstairs, looked at the layout on the kitchen table, rearranged 3 of the samples without acknowledging that I'd been working for 40 minutes, and said, "Can you make sure the dry cleaning is picked up by 4? I have a call until 5:30. I picked up the dry cleaning. But that night, lying in the guest room of their house, the guest room, in a house that my initial financial support had helped them afford, I made a quiet, private decision. I called Marcus back. I told him I would be at the investor meeting. I asked him to handle the introduction however he thought was best. He asked if I wanted to be listed formally in the presentation materials. I told him yes. What followed were 4 weeks of the most peculiar double life I have ever lived. During the days, I continued showing up for Jade's business, picking up slack, running errands, being helpful. In the evenings, I was on video calls with Marcus, reviewing proposals, rereading contracts, remembering exactly who I was and exactly what I had built. It was like exercising a muscle I'd let atrophy slow at first, then faster than I expected. I did not tell Jade. I kept asking myself why not, and the honest answer had layers. Part of me wanted to protect the relationship by not forcing a confrontation before I understood what the confrontation would cost. Part of me, and this is harder to admit, wanted her to find out the way Andrew had found out. Not to humiliate her, but because I needed to understand whether she actually knew who her mother was and had chosen to erase it, or whether she had genuinely forgotten. Those are different things, and I needed to know which one I was dealing with. The investor meeting was held on a Friday evening at a private event space in the Arts District downtown. Marcus had organized it as a cocktail reception, followed by a formal presentation, the kind of event where the drinks were good and the conversation was strategic, and everyone was performing a version of themselves they'd rehearsed. My son-in-law was going to be there. That part I hadn't anticipated. He worked in commercial leasing, which meant he occasionally crossed paths with firms like ours at industry events. When Marcus mentioned that his name was on the RSVP list, my stomach dropped and then, almost immediately, settled into something steady. I thought, fine. Let it be this way. I arrived early and spent 20 minutes with Marcus going over last-minute details. I was wearing a dark green wrap dress that I'd bought in Phoenix years ago and never had occasion to wear because I'd spent 14 months in clothes that said, "I'm here to help." I had my hair down. I was wearing the watch my business partner had given me when we hit our first 10 million in closed deals. I felt, for the first time in a very long time, like myself. The investors arrived in small groups. Marcus introduced me properly to each of them: co-founder, equity partner, the person who had spent 15 years quietly building the firm's most important client relationships. Several of them already knew my name. 2 of them had worked with me directly, years ago, before I stepped back. There were handshakes and genuine recognition, and the particular warmth that comes from being remembered by people who have no reason to pretend. My son-in-law arrived at 7:15. I saw him come in from across the room. He was with a colleague from his leasing firm, a younger guy I didn't know. He scanned the space with the automatic social confidence he always wore, and his eyes passed over me once without stopping. He didn't recognize me. Not immediately. I was standing with a group of investors, speaking, and I was in a different context than he had ever seen me in. And the human brain categorizes people by the boxes it puts them in. In his box, I lived in his guest room and handled scheduling, and never had opinions about anything structural. He came to get a drink at the bar near where I was standing, and I watched the exact moment it clicked. He turned with his glass. Our eyes met, and his face went through 3 separate expressions in about 2 seconds: confusion, then recognition, then something I can only describe as a very fast internal calculation. "Claire," he said, "I didn't know you'd be here." "I'm surprised too," I said, pleasantly. "Are you connected to the Meridian Project?" He explained that his firm handled some of the tenant coordination on properties we'd previously developed, which meant there was a peripheral relationship. He was friendly. He asked how I knew the organizers. I told him Marcus and I founded the company together. I said it simply, without drama, the way you say something that has always been true. The expression that crossed his face, then that particular combination of recalculation and damage assessment, told me everything I needed to know about how much Jade had actually told him about me, which was apparently very little, or he had not been listening. Either way, the picture he had of me, helpful, available, quiet, unimportant, was reorganizing itself in real time, and he did not like it. He excused himself. I watched him move to a corner of the room and take out his phone. Marcus started the formal presentation at 8. He opened by acknowledging the principles behind the firm, and when he said my name and my role, I heard my son-in-law's colleague lean over and say something to him. I didn't hear the words. I saw his face. After the presentation, one of the senior investors, a woman named Patricia, who had been in commercial real estate for 30 years and had the kind of presence that made you want to sit up straighter, came to find me, specifically. She had done business with our firm 4 years ago on a mixed-use development in Austin, and she told me, with the directness of someone who never wastes words, that she was glad I was back in the room. "We always got better results when you were involved," she said. "No offense to Marcus." "None taken," Marcus said, appearing at my elbow with a glass of sparkling water. "She knows it's true." I drove home that night with the windows down, which I know sounds like a small thing. It was November and it was cold and the air was sharp and uncomfortable, and I drove home with the windows down anyway because I needed to feel something real. Jade was awake when I got back. She was in the kitchen with her laptop open and a half-finished glass of wine, and she looked up when I came in, and her face had the particular careful blankness of someone who has already had a version of a conversation in their head and is deciding whether to have it out loud. "Ryan called me," she said. "I put my bag on the counter." "I know. You didn't tell me you were going to be at that event." "No," I said. "I didn't." She looked at me for a moment. "Why?" I sat down across from her, and I thought about how to answer honestly without being cruel, which is always the harder version of honesty, because I wanted to see what would happen when you found out the same way everyone else did, without advance notice, without time to reframe it. She went quiet. "Jade," I said, "how do you introduce me to people?" She looked at her wine glass. "That's not fair. I'm not asking to be unfair. I'm asking because I genuinely want to understand how you think about who I am." What came next was not a single conversation. It was 3 hours of the kind of talking that families do when they've been careful with each other for too long. Messy and circular and sometimes painful, and punctuated by long silences that had more content than the teak words. She told me that she had always felt overshadowed by my accomplishments, and that having me around in a helping role had felt, to her, like a kind of leveling. I told her that I had stepped back because I loved her and felt guilty, and that I had let that guilt hollow me out until I was just a function instead of a person. She cried. I cried, which I almost never do. And I am telling you this because I don't want the story to sound like a clean revenge narrative when the truth was always more complicated than that. My son-in-law came downstairs at 11 and the conversation became different, tighter, more formal. He was sorry, he said, if he had ever given the impression of dismissing me. He was not specific about what form that impression might have taken. He was the kind of person who apologizes for impressions rather than actions, which is its own kind of information. I told him I appreciated it. I meant it partially. The decisions I made in the weeks that followed were not made in anger. I want to be clear about that because it matters. Anger is urgent and imprecise, and it makes you break things you might want later. What I felt was something slower and more deliberate, a quiet commitment to not allowing myself to disappear again under any circumstances, regardless of how much I loved the people doing the disappearing. I called Marcus the Monday after the event and told him I was coming back formally. Not full-time in the operational sense, but as an active equity partner. I would be listed on the website, I would attend client meetings, I would stop being a silent anything. He said, "It's about time," and I heard in his voice that he'd been waiting for this, that he'd known I would get here eventually, and that particular kind of being known by someone felt like standing in sunlight after a long time indoors. I also called my attorney. Not to do anything aggressive, I want to be very clear about this. I called her because I had been operating without any formal protection of my interests for 14 months, and that needed to be corrected. We reviewed the trust documentation. Everything was in order, as it had always been. She suggested a few updates to reflect my renewed active role in the firm, and I agreed to all of them. I did not change any arrangements that affected Jade directly. She had never been a beneficiary of anything I hadn't already designated for her, and that didn't change. What changed was my own clarity about where the lines were, what I was offering because I wanted to, and what I had been giving because I'd been too collapsed by guilt to ask for something in return. I moved out of their guest room in December. I found a small apartment on the east side of the city with good light and a balcony that caught the afternoon sun. I brought almost nothing from storage, just what I actually needed, and I spent 2 days making the space entirely mine, choosing only things I liked, arranging everything according to my own instincts with nobody else's preferences to account for. There is a particular kind of quiet that happens in a space that belongs entirely to you. Not silence exactly, the city was still outside, traffic and neighbor sounds and the occasional dog in the courtyard below, but the quality of the air inside was different. It felt like breathing at the right altitude. Jade and I still talk. It took several months to find a register that worked for both of us, something between the guilty distance I'd accepted before and the enmeshed helpfulness I'd collapsed into after. We are building something more honest now. It's slower and sometimes awkward, and occasionally it requires me to say things that are uncomfortable. And I do. I say them. My son-in-law and I have reached a kind of civil equilibrium. He is careful with me in a way that reads as respect but might be something closer to wariness, and I have decided that I can work with either one. Patricia, the investor from the November event, reached out in January about a potential joint venture on a retail corridor project in Austin. Marcus and I had dinner with her in February. She ordered the most expensive wine on the menu without consulting the table, and told the server to bring a second bottle before we'd finished the first, and I liked her enormously. The project is in early stages. I am cautiously optimistic. There is also someone I've been having coffee with on Thursday mornings, a contractor named David, who does custom renovations and has an extremely distracting habit of talking about load-bearing walls with the same enthusiasm other people reserve for things that are actually exciting. He makes me laugh. He remembered, on our third coffee, that I take mine with 1 sugar and no milk, which sounds minor and is not. I don't know what that becomes. I know it makes Thursday mornings something I look forward to, and after 14 months of dreading most mornings, I am choosing to count that as enough for now. What I want to tell you, what I want to say directly, the way I wish someone had said it to me is this. You can love someone completely and still require them to see you. Those two things are not in conflict. Shrinking yourself is not the same as showing love. It looks like love from the outside, especially to the people who benefit from your shrinking, but from the inside it is something else entirely. It is a slow erasure that happens so gradually, you don't notice until you're standing in a corner of a room you helped build, holding a tray, and the only thing left of you is your usefulness. I am done being useful in that way. I am Claire. I am 43 years old and I co-founded a real estate development firm, and I know more about commercial property acquisition in the Southwest than most people who get introduced by their actual names at industry events. I take my coffee with 1 sugar. I have a scar above my left eyebrow. I drive home sometimes with the windows down in November because the cold air reminds me that I am here, that I am real, that I am not a function or a footnote or someone's mother who helps out around the business. I am here. I take up space, and I am not apologizing for either one.